That's not true. You're all wrong. The small voice cut through the tense silence like a knife. Every head in the courtroom snapped toward the sound. The judge's gavel froze midair. Standing in the aisle, gripping a worn-out stuffed rabbit, was a 10-year-old girl, her eyes fierce, her finger pointing straight at the defendant. No fear, no hesitation, just the truth. And the moment she spoke, everything changed. The air inside the packed courtroom was thick with tension. Every seat was occupied, reporters lined the back wall, and the gallery was filled with murmuring spectators, eagerly waiting for the trial's climax. The case of Daniel Reeves, a respected businessman accused of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar fraud, had gripped the entire city. Judge Monroe, known for his strict demeanor, adjusted his glasses as he turned to the prosecutor. Proceed with your closing argument. The prosecutor, a sharp-looking man in his 40s, stood confidently, straightened his tie, and walked toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, today you've seen overwhelming evidence that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt. That's a lie. The words, though spoken by a child's voice, sliced through the heavy atmosphere like a lightning bolt. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Heads turned in unison, searching for the source of the interruption. Even Judge Monroe's hand, which had been resting near his gavel, froze mid-motion. The silence was deafening. Standing near the aisle, clutching a stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest, was a 10-year-old girl with wide, determined eyes. Murmurs erupted. Who is that? Is she lost? Did she just interrupt the trial? The prosecutor's mouth hung open for a second before he regained his composure. Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate. Someone remove that child. Judge Monroe held up a hand, silencing the room. His sharp gaze locked onto the little girl. Young lady, step forward. The girl hesitated for a moment, then took slow, deliberate steps toward the front of the courtroom. Who are you? Monroe's voice was firm but not unkind. She lifted her chin, gripping her stuffed rabbit tighter. I'm Sophie. Her voice was small yet steady. And I can prove he didn't do it. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Even Daniel Reeves, who had sat stoic and resigned throughout the trial, looked up, his eyes flickering with disbelief. Judge Monroe narrowed his eyes. And just how do you intend to do that? Sophie took a shaky breath, but her resolve did not waver. I have proof. Sophie had never imagined she would stand inside a courtroom, let alone interrupt a trial. Just weeks ago, she was an ordinary 10-year-old girl who spent her afternoons doing homework at the diner where her mother worked. But everything changed the night she first saw Daniel Reeves on the news. It had been a typical evening. Sophie sat on the couch, swinging her legs as her mother, Carla, flipped through the channels. Their apartment was small, the kind of place where the kitchen and living room blended together. The news anchor's voice filled the room. Business mogul Daniel Reeves faces charges of embezzling millions from pension funds, leaving thousands without retirement savings. Sophie's ears perked up. She recognized that name. As the news station displayed his photograph, her stomach twisted. Mom, I know him, she blurted. Carla, exhausted from her shift at the diner, barely looked up. Sophie, you don't know him. Yes, I do. He's the man who helped us when our car broke down last year. Remember? That night was still clear in Sophie's mind. They had been stranded on the side of the road, their old sedan refusing to start. Cars had zoomed past without stopping, except for one. A well-dressed man had pulled over, rolled up his sleeves, and spent nearly an hour helping her mom restart the engine. He hadn't accepted a single dollar for his trouble. Carla sighed, rubbing her temples. Sweetheart, just because someone does one nice thing doesn't mean they're innocent. But Sophie wasn't convinced. As the news anchor continued, something felt off. The evidence against Daniel Reeves was all paper trails and signatures. Nothing about his actions, nothing that proved he was the one who moved the money. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. Finally, she sat up and made a decision. She needed to know the truth. At school the next day, Sophie barely paid attention in class. The moment the final bell rang, she rushed to the Fairfield Public Library, where rows of old newspapers and archived news reports were stored. She searched Daniel Reeves's name, scrolling through articles about his charity work, community service, and company success. The more she read, the less sense the accusations made. Then she found something strange, a photograph from a charity event, dated the same night he was accused of approving the fraudulent transactions. He was smiling, shaking hands with a local mayor. The timestamp didn't lie. Sophie's heart pounded. If he was at the event, he couldn't have signed those papers. But why wasn't this being mentioned in court? Determined, She printed the article and stuffed it into her backpack. But just as she was leaving, something caught her eye. In one of the newer articles, a comment thread had an anonymous post. Reeves is a scapegoat. The real thieves are still free. The comment had been deleted, but Sophie had seen it. Someone out there knew the truth. Her mother always said curiosity was dangerous, but Sophie wasn't just curious. She was certain something was wrong. And when she overheard two men at the diner whispering about making sure Reeves takes the fall, she knew she had to act. Next, she needed proof. Sophie sat at a corner booth in the diner, her untouched milkshake slowly melting as she focused on the two men sitting just a few tables away. They weren't regular customers. They wore dark suits and spoke in hushed tones, leaning toward each other as if they didn't want anyone to hear. But Sophie was listening. She pretended to play on her smartwatch, but in reality she had activated its voice recorder. The men's words were muffled by the clatter of dishes and the hum of the diner's jukebox, but one sentence sent a chill down her spine. Reeves is already finished. No one's going to question the paperwork. The other man nodded. By the time they figure it out, we'll be long gone. Sophie's heart pounded. They were framing Daniel Reeves. She held her breath as she pressed stop on the recording. She needed to get this evidence to someone who could use it. But who would listen to a 10-year-old? At home, she played back the recording on her laptop, using headphones so her mother wouldn't hear. The voices were faint, but clear enough to recognize the words. She had proof, but proof wasn't enough if no one took her seriously. She needed more. The next day, instead of going straight home after school, she went back to the library. She pulled up records of Daniel Reeves' financial transactions, focusing on the specific dates mentioned in the case. That's when she saw it. The money wasn't transferred directly from Reeves' accounts. Instead, it was funneled through several smaller companies, ones that had no real employees or physical addresses, shell companies. Sophie bit her lip, her fingers shaking slightly as she clicked through article after article. Every time she traced a company back to its origin, the paperwork led to the same law firm, the same firm that was handling the case against Reeves. Was that a coincidence? It didn't feel like one. She printed out the financial records and added them to her growing stack of evidence. But before she could leave, a new message popped up on her screen. It was an anonymous email with no subject line. The body of the message contained only 4 words. Stop asking questions, kid. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Someone knew what she was doing. She slammed the laptop shut and grabbed her papers, stuffing them into her backpack. She needed to get home, now. The whole walk back, she kept glancing over her shoulder, feeling as if she were being followed. The streets were busy, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. When she got to her apartment, she locked the door behind her and peeked through the blinds. A black car she didn't recognize was parked across the street. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her smartwatch and replayed the recording. She had everything she needed. Now she just had to make sure the right person heard it. Sophie's heart pounded as she stood in the center of the courtroom, gripping the folded papers in her trembling hands. Every eye was on her, some filled with shock, others with annoyance. The prosecutor's face twisted in irritation, and even the defense attorney looked confused. Judge Monroe leaned forward, his stern gaze locking onto Sophie. Young lady, this is a courtroom, not a playground. You better have a very good reason for interrupting these proceedings. Sophie swallowed hard but didn't waver. I do, Your Honor. I have proof that Daniel Reeves didn't commit this crime. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, and the judge slammed his gavel. Order! Order in the court! The prosecutor scoffed. Your Honor, this is absurd. This child is disrupting a serious trial. She has no authority to present evidence. But Judge Monroe held up a hand to silence him. He studied Sophie carefully. You claim to have proof. Sophie nodded and stepped closer to the bailiff, holding out the papers. These are financial records I found. They show that the money Reeves was accused of stealing didn't go directly to him. It was funneled through fake companies. The bailiff took the papers and handed them to the judge. Monroe adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. His face darkened as he flipped through the pages. The numbers didn't lie. A hushed tension settled over the courtroom. The prosecutor stiffened. This is ridiculous. A child digging through financial records? Who even let her in here? Before Sophie could answer, A chair scraped loudly against the floor, cutting through the tension. Everyone turned toward the sound. A man in a dark suit stood up from the gallery, his face pale, sweat beading at his temple. Sophie's stomach dropped. She recognized him. It was one of the men from the diner, the one who said Reeves would take the fall. His hands curled into fists. His voice shook with anger. "She's lying!" The room exploded into gasps. Sophie took a step back, gripping her stuffed rabbit tightly. Judge Monroe's gaze snapped to the man. "Excuse me? Who are you?" The man's jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the exits. He was panicking. The judge gestured toward the bailiff. "Detain that man for questioning." The bailiff moved swiftly, grabbing the man's arm. He struggled, but two more officers rushed in. "You don't know what you're doing," the man shouted as they dragged him toward the back of the courtroom. "You're making a mistake." Judge Monroe's expression hardened. "We'll determine that soon enough." He turned back to Sophie. "What else do you have?" Sophie's hands trembled as she pulled out her smartwatch. I recorded him. I recorded him admitting that Reeves was being framed." Another collective gasp filled the courtroom. The prosecutor's face lost all color. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. This so-called evidence should be dismissed immediately." But Monroe ignored him. He gestured for the bailiff. "Play the recording." The courtroom fell into complete silence as the audio filled the air. "Reeves is already finished. No one's going to question the paperwork. By the time they figure it out, we'll be long gone." The prosecutor sank into his chair. Reeves's lawyer bolted to his feet, his face a mixture of shock and triumph. "Your Honor, this is clear evidence of a conspiracy." Judge Monroe nodded solemnly. "We will have to investigate this further. Court is adjourned until this new evidence is reviewed." The gavel slammed down. Sophie let out a shaky breath. She had done it. But as she turned to leave, she caught something in the corner of her eye. A man in a black suit standing near the exit, watching her, expressionless, unmoving, her stomach twisted. She wasn't safe yet. The moment Judge Monroe's gavel struck the sound block, the courtroom erupted. People whispered furiously, reporters scrambled to take notes, and the prosecutor furiously flipped through his paperwork as if searching for a way to undo what had just happened. Sophie could still feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had just proven that Daniel Reeves was innocent, but something didn't feel right. She stole another glance toward the exit. The man in the black suit was still there, his expression unreadable. He wasn't moving. He was watching her. The bailiffs were still struggling with the man from the diner, who thrashed against their grip. His outburst had only made things worse for him. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "You don't understand. This isn't over." Judge Monroe's voice boomed through the courtroom. "Take him into custody and get his statement." The bailiffs nodded, dragging the man toward the side doors. But just as they reached the exit, the man in the black suit finally moved. He turned sharply, disappearing into the hallway. Sophie's stomach twisted. Something about him felt dangerous. She turned toward Daniel Reeves, who was still seated at the defense table. For the first time since the trial began, his expression wasn't one of exhaustion and defeat. It was hope. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. The moment the judge called for a recess, he stood up and walked straight toward Sophie. "Young lady," he said, his voice calm but firm, "what you did today might have just saved my client's life." Sophie shifted nervously. "I just told the truth." The lawyer's lips pressed into a tight smile. "The truth is a powerful thing." He hesitated. "But powerful people don't like when it comes out." Sophie knew what he meant. Someone wasn't happy about what she had done. Her mother, Carla, finally broke through the crowd and rushed toward her. "Sophie, what were you thinking?" Sophie barely had time to react before her mother pulled her into a tight hug. "You could have gotten yourself hurt," Carla murmured. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sophie hesitated. "Because I knew you'd tell me not to." Carla sighed, her grip tightening. "You're my daughter, Sophie. Keeping you safe is more important than anything." A sudden crash from the hallway made everyone jump. A bailiff rushed back inside, his face tense. "Your Honor, the suspect has escaped." Gas filled the room. Judge Monroe's face darkened. "How?" "A black SUV was waiting outside. Two men grabbed him before we could react." Sophie's blood ran cold. the man in the black suit. He had been waiting for this. Judge Monroe turned toward the prosecutor, his patience completely gone. It seems there's far more going on here than this court was led to believe. The prosecutor, for the first time all trial, had nothing to say. Sophie clutched her mother's hand. She had done the right thing. She knew that. But now someone out there knew who she was, and they weren't going to let this go. That night, Sophie lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. The glow-in-the-dark stars she had stuck up there years ago seemed dimmer than usual. She couldn't stop thinking about the man in the black suit. Who was he? Why had he been watching her? And worse, how did he know the man from the diner? Her mother had been on edge ever since they left the courthouse. She had barely spoken on the drive home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Sophie rolled over and checked her smartwatch. It was past midnight. The house was quiet. Her mother had finally gone to sleep after double-checking that the doors and windows were locked. Just as Sophie was about to close her eyes, her phone buzzed. She frowned. Who would be texting her this late? Reaching over, she grabbed her phone and squinted at the screen. It was an unknown number. There was no name, no introduction, just 4 words in bold capital letters. "Stop digging, little girl." Sophie's stomach twisted. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen. She sat up in bed and peeked through the blinds. A black car was parked across the street. It was the same one she had seen outside the courthouse. She gasped and ducked down, pressing her back against the wall. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Were they watching her house? Her mind raced. She had expected people to be upset about what she revealed in court, but she hadn't expected this. Her mother's voice suddenly called from the hallway. "Sophie? What are you doing awake?" Sophie hesitated before stuffing her phone under her pillow. "Nothing, Mom. Just couldn't sleep." Carla sighed and stepped into the room. "Me neither." She sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. "You scared me today, you know." Sophie bit her lip. "I had to do it." Her mother sighed. "I know." Then she looked toward the window, a small crease forming between her brows. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" Sophie hesitated, debating whether to tell her about the message. But before she could say anything, the sound of a car engine roaring to life made them both freeze. Carla rushed to the window, pulling the blinds back just in time to see the black car speed away into the night. Sophie swallowed hard. They weren't safe. Not yet. The next morning, Carla didn't let Sophie go to school. She paced the small living room, checking the locks again and again, while nervously glancing out the window. "Mom, we can't just sit here," Sophie said, gripping her stuffed rabbit tightly. "We have to do something." Carla exhaled sharply. "Sophie, you're 10 years old. I shouldn't even be having this conversation with you." Sophie opened her mouth to argue, but then her phone buzzed again. She hesitated before picking it up. Another unknown number. This time there was a picture attached. Her heart nearly stopped. It was a grainy image, but there was no mistaking it. It was her and her mother walking out of the courthouse. The timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken yesterday. A message followed. "We're watching." Sophie's breath hitched. Her mother's face paled as she read the text over her shoulder. "That's it. We're going to the police." But Sophie shook her head. "Mom, the police aren't going to stop this. Someone high up is covering everything up. We need to go to someone who actually cares." Carla frowned. "Like who?" Sophie hesitated, then grabbed Rachel's notebook from her backpack. Flipping through the pages, she found the name she had circled earlier. A reporter. "This guy," she said, pointing to the name. "He's been investigating the fraud case for months. If we give him everything, he can expose it to the public." Carla bit her lip, scanning the name. "Ethan Gray," she sighed. "If we do this, we have to be careful." Sophie nodded. She knew the risks, but she also knew they had no other choice. They had to move fast, because whoever was watching them wasn't going to wait much longer. Sophie and Carla hurried down the crowded street, glancing over their shoulders every few seconds. The black SUV was still following them. "Mom, they're still there," Sophie whispered. Carla tightened her grip on Sophie's hand. "We need to lose them." They ducked into a small grocery store, weaving through the aisles. When they finally emerged from the back exit, the SUV was nowhere in sight. Rushing toward their destination, they reached a small coffee shop, where Ethan Gray, the investigative, Journalist was waiting. He looked skeptical as Carla slid the printed financial records across the table. I've been covering this case for months. What makes you think you have something new? Sophie took a deep breath and played the smartwatch recording. Ethan's face changed instantly. His doubt turned into shock as he listened to the voices discussing how Daniel Reeves was set up. This, this is solid evidence. He looked at Sophie in disbelief. Kid, do you realize what you've uncovered? Sophie nodded. So, will you help us? Ethan didn't hesitate. I'm publishing this tonight. By the next morning, the media had exploded with the story. Headlines flashed on TV screens. Breaking news, fraud case a setup. New evidence emerges. Daniel Reeves' case takes a shocking turn. Judge Monroe immediately ordered a full review of the case. The prosecutor, now under scrutiny, refused to comment. The public demanded answers. Meanwhile, at home, Sophie and Carla felt a moment of relief, but it didn't last long. That night, their apartment door was kicked open. Carla screamed as Sophie grabbed her smartwatch and hid behind the couch. Heavy footsteps stormed inside. The man in the black suit. Where's the evidence? He growled. Before he could search the apartment, red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Sirens wailed. The FBI burst through the door. Weapons drawn. Hands up! Don't move! The man tried to run, but agents tackled him to the ground. The next morning, Daniel Reeves was cleared of all charges. Multiple arrests were made, and the FBI confirmed that high-ranking officials were involved in the fraud. Sophie sat on the couch, watching the news as her mother hugged her tight. You did it, sweetheart, Carla whispered. You saved him. But Sophie's eyes remained on the screen. One detail made her blood run cold. Authorities are still searching for one missing suspect. A grainy security image appeared. The man in the black suit. He was still out there, watching, waiting, and Sophie knew this wasn't truly over.